Okay, so I'm going to be talking about something that I know we all love thinking about and we think about every day, and that's failures in California's electricity market. Okay, so I'm going to give a brief overview of how the grid works. It's going to be really oversimplified, so if you have some questions, just come up and ask me afterwards. So this is kind of a simplified version of how it works, and so traditionally, we have big power plants. So this could be your coal-fired power plant that you all saw when driving to Prin. It could be some pretty massive solar systems or wind turbine farms or a nuclear plant or things like that. After you've burned something or done something really creative, to get your electricity, you want to step it up with a generator. This essentially just increases the voltage, so then when it goes onto your transmission lines, it can travel across the country really quickly, and the faster you can move your electricity, the more efficient it is, which is why we have a separation between transmission and distribution. So distribution are the power lines that you see driving around your home. They're the ones that connect into your home or your workplace. Transmission are those really, really big ones you see when you're driving across the country. If you touch a distribution line on accident, it may kill you. It may not. If you touch a transmission line, you're toasted. And then the last sector is when it actually gets to you, and so this is kind of the commercial side and the delivery of electricity to your home. And this is kind of the model that we've seen. We've seen electrons be formed over here and moving all the way this way throughout history. This is how the grid has developed. It's become really, really massive until recently, and we're seeing a few things kind of change up the market. The first is the addition of the prosumer, which is a producer and a consumer in one. So if any of you have solar panels on your roof, you are a prosumer because you are pumping electricity onto the grid when the sun is shining. The other thing is the increase of solar and to an extent wind power as well. The reason that this is kind of switching it up is because the sun doesn't shine all the time, especially when you want it to, and the wind doesn't blow all the time, and so you have to be accommodating for more variable sources, whereas traditionally your large power plants are really consistent. And then the other thing, which a lot of people credit Elon Musk with doing, is increasing grid scale battery storage and storage for these variable energy types. So that's making renewable energy more applicable. So now, even though we've seen electrons moving one way throughout all of history, we're starting to see it go back, and that's causing a lot of problems, okay? So overarching this whole system of technology, there's kind of three mini markets within the electricity market, right? So the first one is generation. And so companies will build power plants and then they make money by selling that electricity to utility companies, right? These could be the utility companies themselves, or it could be a third party. Then you have this extra one, which are your electricity delivery charges. It's essentially your hookup to the grid. If you use a lot of electricity, you have higher delivery charges. It's usually just a couple cents per kilowatt hour of what you're using added onto your bill every month. For those of you who actually pay an electricity bill in the audience, you can see it actually written out as a line item on your bill. They separate it out for you so you can see how much your utility is charging you for this. And then you have the commercial side over here, where your utility, most likely, is selling you electricity. You probably don't have a lot of choice in the matter. Most of you, if you do have electricity here, are on Ameren. You don't really have another choice of where you want to get your electricity from. And in that case, you are not the consumer in this market. You are the rate taker or the rate payer. That's the official term in the industry. Which goes to show that they just don't really care about you that much. And so in California, which is where I'm from, in Northern California, our big utility is Pacific Gas and Electric. And if you haven't heard of them, great job not watching the news, but they're not that great. They are a vertically integrated investor-owned utility. And that's a really complicated way of saying that they own the entire system, so the generation, the transmission and distribution, and the commercial retail. They also own 78% of the total market share, which means that they're a monopoly. And a monopoly means that one company or entity basically controls the sale of a good. The reason monopolies are bad is because in a competitive market, you're paying the marginal cost to produce that good. In a monopoly without competition, you're paying a higher rate for what you would get in a competitive market. And that additional cost that you're spending could be spent somewhere else, which would help the economy somewhere else. The other issue, which is really prevalent in PG&E, is benevolence, right? And so if you're a monopoly and you're not beholden to your consumers, then you don't care about them. I'll talk a little bit about how this has gotten out of hand in California. My other argument is that not only is PG&E a monopoly, but they're also a monopsony, something maybe not everyone has heard of, which is kind of the flip of a monopoly, in which there's a market situation with only one buyer, right? So you have the generation side, where PG&E is a monopsony because they're the only ones buying generation. They're also a player in that market, but they're buying it. And then you have them on the monopoly side selling it to consumers, right? So it's because we have two different mini markets within the larger one. And that kind of double-sided economic issue is really just hurting everyone involved. So that comes to my first question. How is it possible that PG&E can be both? David?
Because they own 78% of the shale and they're also selling. So they're the only one buying and then they're also the only one selling.
Yep. Good job, David. Okay, so for those of you who aren't from California and don't think that much about electricity, PG&E has been in the news a lot recently. They declared bankruptcy in January for the second time this century in response to killing a bunch of their consumers. Turns out, since you're a monopoly, they didn't lose any market share from killing a couple hundred people. They caused a lot of wildfires. They blew up a gas pipeline accidentally, and that killed an entire neighborhood. There's also a lot of evidence to suggest that the water crisis in California is also their fault, because when you burn down 5,000 buildings, a bunch of toxins enter the water table, and then you can't drink any of that water anymore. So we're seeing some really intense chemicals being added to the water in Northern California, so people are losing their property value and things like that. And it's kind of a new thing that they've declared bankruptcy. There's a lot of questions about what we should do about it. And so that's where I came in, and I came up with a solution, because I'm an action person. I like tangible things that we can do to solve things. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So the first thing we need to do is solve the transmission and distribution problem. In that big graphic I showed you earlier, we had generation, transmission and distribution, and commercial retail. And right now, the entire thing is a monopoly. But the only part that needs to be a monopoly because of the technology is transmission and distribution. And so that's the actual delivery of energy. The reason it needs to be a monopoly, I'm gonna give a kind of an analogy here, is when we think about the trucking industry can deliver anywhere because the system that they use are the roads. If trucking was a monopoly, the barrier to entry in the trucking market would be building an entirely new set of roads, which just does not make sense. It's such a waste of money and no one would do it, which is why roads are owned and maintained by the government. The same thing needs to happen in transmission and distribution, because every electron that enters the grid from generation has to equal one electron that's going out, which is really hard to monitor and needs to be done by someone who is in control and knows what they're doing. And it also can't be done for profit, because when you are charging electricity delivery charges, the way you make money is by not maintaining your grid. And that's really bad because that's when people die, right? So we want to kind of get rid of that. And so we want to make it a government entity or a third-party nonprofit like a co-op. Now, usually the solution to monopolies is to break them up, trust busting. And so that competition can kind of take care of the problems. And we heard a little bit about it. The reason broken up monopolies and competitive markets work is something called the invisible hand, which is basically saying that the collective decisions of everyone involved in the market guide the market towards the best consumer interests because everyone wants to maximize their utility. The reason that works is because no one person or one company can buy or sell so much of that good that they can affect the price as a whole. But when in electricity, you have to have supply and demand to be equal at every moment, every day, turns out one generation facility or one group of consumers with solar on their roof can actually change supply and demand. So the typical solution, which is just create competition, wouldn't work, which is why this is so exciting. What typically controls a competitive market that isn't in place in electricity? It was bolded on that last slide. Yeah.
The invisible hand?
Yeah, the invisible hand. Great. So my solution is to break up PG&E into smaller regional municipal utilities. There are already some in California and across the US. And essentially what RMUs do is they are nonprofit kind of government entities. And so they run like a business, but their shareholders are the people that they represent. And so their board of directors are elected by the people, and they have term limits and things like that. And it solves this benevolence issue that I talked about when talking about monopolistic issues, right? And so when you are elected by your group of people, you probably want to get reelected, and you probably really care, hopefully, about what you're doing. And so you're going to try and not kill your consumers. Seems pretty easy to me. It also protects consumers against market manipulations. In the early 2000s, California tried to fully deregulate. And for those of you who've heard of a company called Enron, they were really, really good at manipulating the market price of electricity by turning off generation facilities at key points in the day. They also tried to solve that problem by recalling California's governor. That's how we got the governator. That's why he went in for so long. And so RMUs, regional municipal utilities, would kind of protect against the situation happening again because we clearly have learned a lot since the last time. So I'm from Northern California. So I'm not in SMUD's district, but I'm pretty close. SMUD is a really successful regional municipal utility. They represent over 600,000 people. The county of Sacramento voted to become a regional municipal utility back in the 1920s, and then were legally allowed to be one 30 years later after a really long legal battle with PG&E. But they got it. So they have 7 elected board seats, and if you look at them over the entire time they've been in competition with PG&E, they have cheaper rates, and they also have lower emissions, which is really important when talking about the future of energy, because people want to solve climate change, and electricity is one of the main reasons that you do that. So I just want to finish with a quote from one of Dr. Hellman's favorite economists, and kind of the quote that inspired my entire capstone, and that is, "It is not the lack of innovative ideas that set boundaries for economic development, but rather powerful social and economic interests promoting the technological status quo." And I like to put that up because we have already solved the energy crisis that's happening. There's just a lot of interests at play to keep it the same. There's a lot of fear from the early 2000s crisis keeping PG&E in power. There's a lot of lobbying from PG&E keeping them in power. But we already have a solution. We just have to have the social capital and the will to do it. Thank you.